Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching, whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. And before we dive into the story, my mum said we can't get to 1,000 subscribers. Can you help me prove her wrong? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey. Let's show her what we can do. Now, let's dive into the story. The moment Selah Crane walked through the door of the Silver Spur Saloon, every conversation died. Not because she was loud, not because she was armed, but because she was a woman, dusty, bleeding from a gash above her left eyebrow, and she was dragging a 6-year-old boy by the hand who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Outside, the wind off the Sangre de Cristo mountains hammered the shutters like an angry fist. The sky was the color of a bruise, somewhere between purple and rage. A storm was coming, and it was coming fast. Selah didn't care about the storm. She cared about the chair. There was one empty seat beside the fire, a wide wooden chair with a high back, close enough to the flames that steam was already rising from the coat draped across its arm. Her boy, Eli, was shaking. His lips had gone the blue-gray of twilight, and his fingers were so cold they'd locked into tiny claws. She moved toward the chair. "That seat's taken." The voice came from a man named Corvin Holt, wide as a barn door, elbows planted on the bar like 2 fence posts. He didn't even look at her when he said it. He just raised his chin toward the chair with the lazy authority of someone who had never once been told no. The chair was empty. Visibly, obviously, undeniably empty. The coat across its arm belonged to no one in the room. That was plain enough. But the men around Corvin nodded like he'd just spoken scripture. A few of them snickered. One of them, a weasel-faced man with a red kerchief tied around his wrist, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something that made them both laugh. Selah heard the word squatter drift across the room like smoke. She stood still. She was 31 years old, and she had survived things that would have killed most men in this room twice over. But she looked at Eli's blue lips and felt something crack open inside her chest that wasn't quite defeat and wasn't quite fury. It was something worse. It was helplessness. "Please," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but it cost her not to let it. "My son is sick. We've been riding 3 days through the pass. The Remont Trail washed out, and we had to climb the ridge. He needs heat." She said it plainly, without begging, the way a person states a fact they believe the world should be decent enough to accept. The room was silent. The fire crackled. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains like a slow drum. Corvin Holt finally looked at her, really looked at her. And what she saw in his eyes was not cruelty exactly. It was something smaller and meaner than cruelty. It was the smug satisfaction of a man who understood power only as the ability to withhold. "Then go home," he said. "Oh, wait," he smiled. "You ain't got one." The laughter came sharp and ugly, bouncing off the low ceiling like buckshot. Eli pressed his face into his mother's coat. Selah didn't move. She was still standing there when the door opened again. Not from the wind this time. The door opened with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of someone who was not lost and was not afraid and had nowhere in the world he needed to be except exactly here. He filled the frame the way mountains fill the horizon, not violently, but completely. He wore a coat made from elk hide, smoke-darkened and older than most of the men in the room. His beard was iron gray, and his eyes were the color of a deep lake in January. Still, cold, and hiding something enormous beneath the surface. Nobody in the Silver Spur said his name out loud, but Sela saw it ripple through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Shoulders tightened. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even Corvin Holt's smirk slid just slightly sideways, though the man caught it quick and pasted it back before anyone might notice. The mountain man's name was Orrin Vass, and in this part of New Mexico, that name meant something. Orrin Vass stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the wind push snow in around his boots. He looked at the room. Then he looked at the woman. Then he looked at the boy with the blue lips clinging to her coat. His expression did not change. He walked straight to the fire, past the bar, past the snickering men, past Corvin Holt, reached down, picked up the empty chair with one hand, and set it directly in front of the flames. He looked at Sela. "Sit," he said. Just that. One word. Quiet as a winter morning, and twice as cold. Sela sat. She pulled Eli onto her lap and wrapped her coat around both of them, and for one long, suspended moment, the entire Silver Spur Saloon held its breath. Corvin Holt's face had gone a deep, mottled red. He pushed off the bar. "Now hold on just 1 minute." Orrin Vass turned to look at him, and Corvin Holt stopped talking. Just like that. The mountain man hadn't raised a hand, hadn't raised his voice. He had only turned his eyes, and that was enough. 3 days before she walked into the Silver Spur, Sela Crane was standing in the doorway of a 2-room house on the edge of the Cimarron Valley, watching her husband ride away from her for the last time. His name was Dex Crane, and he had the kind of handsome face that people trusted too quickly, all easy smiles and warm eyes, the sort of man who made people feel chosen when he looked at them. He'd made Sela feel that way once, 6 years ago, when he'd shown up at her father's trading post in a coat too thin for October, and borrowed $1 he'd never returned. She hadn't minded. She'd been 25 and lonesome, and he'd had a laugh like the first warm day after a hard winter. She hadn't known then what she would learn slowly, painfully, over the next 6 years. That a man's charm and a man's character are 2 entirely different animals, and they do not always live in the same skin. Dex had not always been cruel. That was the part that made it hard to leave, the memory of who he had been on the good days, which grew fewer as the years passed, and the debts climbed higher and the whiskey got cheaper. In the early years he worked, not hard, not consistently, but enough. He could fix a fence, gentle a horse, talk a merchant down to a fair price. Eli was born in the spring of their 3rd year, and for a few months after, Dex had seemed to wake up. He'd held that baby with a gentleness that had made Sela's heart ache. But something in him curdled before Eli's first birthday, quiet as milk going bad. The stay work stopped. The drinking started earlier each morning. He borrowed money he never paid back and made promises he never intended to keep. And when Sela asked hard questions, he answered with silence, or worse. The morning he rode away, she'd found the deed to their land on the table. Signed over, not to her, not to Eli. Signed over to a man named Harlan Royce, who ran a cattle operation out of Taos, and who Sela had never met in her life. There was a note underneath, 3 words in Dex's careless scrawl: "Square the debt." That was it. No apology. No explanation. No goodbye to his son, who was in the back room, building something out of sticks and dried mud, and humming softly to himself, in the way little children do when they still believe the world is fundamentally kind. Sela stood at that table for a long time. Long enough for the coffee to go cold. Long enough for the rage to burn through her and leave something harder and clearer behind. Then she began to pack. She took what they could carry, 2 bedrolls, a cast-iron pan, dried venison, her father's pistol with 6 bullets, Eli's wooden horse that he refused to leave behind, and every dollar she had hidden over 3 years in the lining of her winter coat, $47.63, which she had skimmed from the household money a few coins at a time against exactly this kind of day. She'd known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this day was coming. She had prepared for it the way people prepare for winter, quietly, methodically, without drama, because survival is not dramatic. It is simply a series of decisions made in the dark before anyone else wakes up. She saddled the old roan mare, hers not Dex's, bought with her own wages before the marriage, and lifted Eli up in front of her and pointed them north. She had a sister in Cimarron, or she'd had one 7 years ago when they'd last spoken. An argument over the wedding, over Dex, over her sister's warning that Selah hadn't wanted to hear. She didn't know if the sister would take her in. She didn't know if the roads were clear. She didn't know if Harlan Royce would send men after the land, or if he was satisfied with the deed alone. She knew almost nothing, and she rode north anyway, because north was away, and away was the only direction that made sense. On the second day, the storm caught them on the Remont Trail. The creek had swollen across the path with 3 days of early mountain melt, and the roan couldn't cross. They climbed. The ridge was brutal, narrow path, loose shale, wind that wanted to pull them both off the edge and into the canyon below. Eli didn't cry. He pressed his face against her arm and held on. By the time they came down the other side into the valley where Arroyos Blancos sat, the boy was cold in a way that frightened her. Nobody in Arroyos Blancos knew Orrin Vass's full story, and those who thought they did were usually wrong about half of it. What they knew: he had arrived some 14 years ago with a mule, a rifle, a hand-drawn map of the high country, and no apparent interest in explaining himself to anyone. He had built a cabin so far up the northern face of the mountain that it was invisible from the valley floor, and for the first 2 years, most people assumed he'd died up there in the first hard winter. Then he started coming down once a month to trade furs, fox, beaver, elk, the occasional mountain lion, and people realized he hadn't died at all. He'd simply chosen to live at a distance that made conversation difficult. Nobody took it personally. The West was full of men who needed distance between themselves and the rest of humanity, and most of them had good reasons that were none of your business. What was known about Orrin Vass, beyond the furs and the silence: he did not drink. He paid his debts the same day he made them. He had once, 3 years ago, pulled a man named Peter Kral from a burning barn with his own hands and sustained burns on both forearms that had healed into thick, rope-like scars he never tried to hide. He had also, that same year, walked into the office of the county land agent and laid a document on the desk that proved the agent had fraudulently transferred 6 homestead parcels to a railroad land company, and had then stood there calmly while the agent tried to bluster his way out of it until the man had gone white and reached for his bottom drawer, at which point Orrin had said, very quietly, "Don't." The agent hadn't. The homesteaders had gotten their land back. Orrin Vass had accepted no payment and refused every drink that was offered to him in celebration. The other thing they knew, or half knew, the way you half know things that people only mention in low voices, was that Orrin Vass had had a family once. A wife. A daughter. The details were murky, the way muddy water is murky, where you can tell there's something down there, but you can't quite make out the shape. Some said the wife had died in childbirth. Others said she'd left. A few, the ones who'd known him longest and trusted the evidence of their own eyes, said he'd had a look about him, in the early years especially, like a man carrying something he could never put down and was too proud to ask for help holding. That look had faded over the years, or maybe he'd just learned to carry it better. Either way, it was there if you knew where to look. And on the night he walked into the Silver Spur and saw a woman and a sick child being refused a seat by the fire, something in that look moved. He hadn't planned to stop at the Silver Spur. He was coming down the mountain for his monthly trade. 2 fox pelts, a beaver, dried herbs that Widow Benneker in the mercantile used for her medicines. And the storm had pushed him off schedule by 2 days. He was tired and cold and looking forward to being indoors for approximately 30 minutes before heading back up. He heard the laughter from outside, the specific kind of laughter that a room full of men makes when they're laughing at someone who can't fight back. He knew that sound. It was the sound of small people making themselves feel large at someone else's expense, and it was a sound that had, at various points in his life, cost him enormously and taught him well. He pushed open the door. He saw the woman. He saw the boy. He saw the empty chair, and the calculation he made was not complicated. After he set the chair by the fire, after the room went quiet and Corvin Holt's bluster died in his throat, Orrin Vass went to the bar and ordered coffee. Not whiskey, never whiskey, and stood with his back to the room in the deliberate way of a man who wants it, understood that he considers the matter settled. He could hear the woman behind him, could hear the small sounds of the boy being warmed, a little cough, a shaky breath, then gradually the sounds of someone coming back to the world. The barkeep, a phlegmatic man named Abe Doss, who had seen enough to know when trouble was finished and when it was only pausing, set Orrin's coffee down without a word. Corvin Holt muttered something to his friends. One of them laughed, but it was a short and uncertain laugh, the kind of laugh that is mostly a question. Are we still doing this? Orrin sipped his coffee. He did not turn around. He didn't need to. Some silences speak louder than a cocked hammer, and his was one of them. Eli fell asleep in front of the fire with the sudden total collapse of a child who has held on as long as he could, and then surrendered to warmth and safety all at once. One moment he was sitting rigid in Selah's lap, shivering. The next, he was a dead weight against her chest, breathing slow and deep, his face pink from the heat, his fingers finally uncurled from their frozen grip on her coat. Selah held him and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of the last 3 days. The cold, the ridge, the fear, the letter on the table. The sound of Dex's horse going away down the road. She didn't cry. She was not by nature a woman given to tears in public, and even in private she treated them like an expense, something to be rationed carefully when the situation truly warranted it. But her jaw tightened, and her eyes went bright, and anyone looking closely might have seen her lips press into a line that had everything to do with grief and nothing at all to do with weakness. The storm outside had settled into a steady roar. Wind drove needles of snow against the saloon windows, and the temperature inside the room dropped noticeably each time the door swung open for a new arrival. The Silver Spur filled up with stranded travelers and frustrated ranchers and 2 shepherds who'd come in from the high pasture with ice in their beards and hollow, road-beaten eyes. Nobody bothered Selah now. Corvin Holt had retreated to the far end of the bar and was working his way through a bottle with the dedicated focus of a man trying to convince. Himself, he hadn't lost anything. His friends had peeled away from him one by one, the way lesser animals edge away from a predator that has just been outranked. The room rearranged itself around the new reality. The mountain man was here, the woman and her boy were under the fire, and certain things were simply not going to happen tonight. Oren Vars finished his coffee and ordered a second one. He could feel Sela watching him from across the room, not with the gratitude he often found uncomfortable and didn't know what to do with, but with the measuring look of a woman trying to understand a thing before she decided how to feel about it. He recognized that look. He'd had a wife who'd looked at the world that way, with clear, steady eyes that refused to accept what they couldn't examine first. The recognition was sharp and strange, like pressing a thumb against an old scar and finding it still tender. He turned around. She was watching him openly, not hiding it, which he respected. "Your boy warmed up?" he asked. His voice was low, accustomed to speaking to mountains and trees more than people. "Getting there," she said. "Thank you." "Don't mention it." "I'd like to mention it," she said. "People don't do that kind of thing without reason. I'd like to know yours." He considered that for a moment. Most people, when he helped them, wanted to thank him and be done with it. They didn't ask him why. It was the kind of directness that could mean arrogance or could mean something more complicated, and he was experienced enough to tell the difference. "Empty chair," he said. "Cold child." Men laughing. He paused. "Reasons enough." She studied him. "You from up the mountain?" 14 years, he said. "You passing through or stopping?" "Looking for my sister," she said. "Benita Rojas. Married name. She was in Cimarron last I heard." Something shifted in Oren's expression. Too fast and too small for most people to catch. But Sela Crane had spent 6 years reading a man's face for the difference between what he said and what he meant, and her eyes were well trained. "You know her," she said. It wasn't a question. Oren set his coffee cup down. "Your sister," he said slowly, "moved from Cimarron about 2 years ago." He paused again, and this time the pause had a weight to it. "She's buried up on the hill past the Rojas homestead. Fever. I'm sorry." The saloon was loud around them. Voices, boots, the crack and pop of the fire. But between Salah and Oren Vars, the world went absolutely still. She sat with that news for a long moment, holding her sleeping son, her face doing the work of a woman who receives a blow and refuses to fall. Oren watched her. He didn't look away, and he didn't fill the silence with useless words, and she was grateful for that more than she could have said. Finally, she let out a long, slow breath through her nose. "She tried to warn me," Sela said quietly, more to herself than to him. "About my husband. 7 years ago. She looked at the fire." "I didn't listen." Oren said nothing. What was there to say to that? He knew about the warnings you don't take until they're behind you. He knew about the cost of looking back. He picked up his coffee cup and then set it back down without drinking. And in the complicated country between what he felt and what he showed, something shifted, like deep snow settling after a long freeze. He looked at the boy sleeping against Selah's chest. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Somewhere warm." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the bar. The storm lasted 2 days. The Silver Spur became a crowded, restless, smoky village unto itself. Men sleeping against walls, cards played at every table by lantern light, arguments over rations, and through it all, Oren Vars moving through the room with the unhurried quiet of a man who has long since made peace with confined spaces, because he knows the outdoors is waiting, exactly where he left it. He checked on Sela and Eli twice a day. Not hovered, checked, like a man noting the weather. Quick, practical, then gone. Eli's fever came on the second night, sudden and mean, and it was Orrin who went to the mercantile across the street in the howling dark and pounded on Abe Doss's back door, and came back 20 minutes later with willow bark tea and a poultice from Widow Benacca's supply that he'd apparently woken the old woman to retrieve. He gave both to Sella without ceremony and stood back. She said to steep it 10 minutes, he said. The poultice goes on his chest. He was already moving away before she could thank him. Sella watched him across the crowded room when he wasn't looking. She had the habit, born of 6 years in a marriage that had required vigilance, of reading people through what they did when they believed no one was watching. When a man at the back table started speaking roughly to the young serving girl, Orrin was beside him in 4 strides, no drama, no announcement, and spoke something low into the man's ear that made him go pale and refocus his attention entirely on his plate. When the youngest of the 2 shepherds couldn't stop shaking, even after an hour inside, Orrin shrugged off his elk-hide coat without hesitation and passed it over. He spent the rest of the night in his shirt sleeves. Nobody commented, because nobody wanted to invite the look they'd get for doing so. He wasn't performing any of it. That was the thing that struck her most. He wasn't trying to be seen. The fever broke on the second morning. Eli woke up hot and exhausted, and demanding food with the cheerful tyranny of a child who has been sick and considers this sufficient grounds for whatever he wants next. Selah got him broth from the kitchen and sat beside him, and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like weeks. When Orrin came by that morning, he looked at the boy eating, and something passed across his face so quickly it was almost invisible. But Selah caught it, a look of raw relief, quiet and personal, that told her this had mattered to him in ways that went past charity. She filed it away without asking about it. Later, when Eli was napping again and the storm had finally dropped to a dull groan outside, Orrin sat across from her and said, "I have a proposition." She raised her eyebrows. He didn't flinch. "Not that kind," he said, and something in his voice was dry enough that she actually smiled, which surprised them both slightly. "There's a homestead empty about 3 miles south of my cabin," he said. "Owner died last winter. No heirs. The land agent has been trying to sell it off to Harlan Royce's cattle company for 6 months, but the deed's still clean. If someone files a homestead claim before the agent completes the transfer, the land is theirs by right." He paused. "It's a good piece of land. South-facing slope, spring creek, timber enough to rebuild the cabin. The cabin itself needs work, a season's worth, maybe more." He looked at her with the measuring directness of a man who didn't waste time on indirection. "I know the land agent and I know the law, and I can get you the paperwork before Royce does, if you want it." Selah stared at him. "Why?" she said. He said it again. "Don't mention it." "I'm mentioning it," she said, just as she had before. He almost smiled, because Harlan Royce is not a good man, and that land shouldn't go to him, and because— he stopped, started again. "Because a child who can hold on through a mountain ridge in a March storm deserves a place to plant roots." She sat with the offer. It was enormous, and it was risky, and it required trust in a stranger she'd known for 2 days, which, under normal circumstances, would have been enough reason to refuse it. But her circumstances were not normal, and she had $47 and nowhere to go, and a sister in the ground, and a boy with a fading fever, and she had spent long enough waiting for the safer option to understand that the safer option was not always the one that looked that way. She thought about the chair, the empty chair that everyone in that room had agreed to treat as taken until one man had simply picked it up and moved it. She thought about what that kind of decision cost a person, the willingness to act plainly in the face of everyone who had decided to look away. She thought about Eli's blue lips and what would have happened if the door hadn't opened. "All right," she said. "I'll hear the details." Oren nodded once, as though she'd simply confirmed what he already knew. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded document. He'd already started the paperwork. Harlan Royce arrived in Arroyos Blancos on the third morning, when the storm had finally thinned to a grey, sullen sky and the streets were shin-deep in snow. He came with 3 men on big horses and a 4th man who wasn't a rider, but who carried a leather satchel with the careful love that certain men reserve for documents. The land agent, Cull Prater, a pinch-faced man in a too large coat who had been efficiently selling off other people's claims for 11 years, and who considered this a perfectly respectable occupation. Royce himself was a tall man, broad-shouldered and silver-templed, with the kind of face that photographers liked. Strong jaw, direct gaze, the comfortable authority of someone who had been powerful for long enough that power had stopped being interesting and was simply the condition of his existence. He dismounted at the Silver Spur with the air of someone arriving at a place he already owned. He did not know, when he walked in, that Oren Vass was there. That was the first surprise. He also didn't know, couldn't have known, that 2 hours earlier, Oren had sent a rider to the county seat with a fully completed homestead claim for the DeLacy parcel, signed by one Seller Crane, with the $47.63 application fee wrapped in a cloth inside the rider's coat. The paperwork had been prepared with the kind of meticulous care that came from a man who had done this before, who had, in fact, spent the last 3 years quietly watching which parcels were vulnerable to exactly this kind of quiet theft and building a mental inventory of the law that applied to each one. Oren had not mentioned any of this to Seller in detail. He had simply said the paperwork was in order and given her his word, and she had chosen, with her eyes open and her judgment engaged, to accept that. Royce's gaze moved across the room with the systematic sweep of a man assessing inventory. It stopped on Oren Vass. Something complicated happened in Royce's expression. Not quite fear, not quite respect, but the unsettled look of a man who has walked into a room and found it rearranged from how he left it. "Vass," he said. His voice was even. "Royce," Oren said, without looking up from his coffee. "Heard you. We're up in the pass." "Came down early," Oren said. Royce moved to the bar, and Cull Prater followed, clutching his satchel. They spoke in low voices. Seller, sitting by the now quiet fire with Eli, drawing patterns in the ash dust with a stick, watched them. She couldn't hear the words, but she understood the posture. Royce was being told something he hadn't expected, and he didn't like it. His back straightened. His hand came down flat on the bar. Prater said something else, small and apologetic. Royce turned and looked across the room, not at Oren this time, at Seller. The look lasted only a moment, but it said everything. He had identified her. He had identified the problem, and he was now recalculating. She held his gaze. She had looked at harder men than Harlan Royce across the breakfast table every morning for 3 years, and she had learned that looking away was the first and most expensive mistake a person could make. He looked away first. He turned back to Prater and said, something sharp and precise, then straightened his coat and walked back out of the Silver Spur into the grey morning light without a word to anyone. His 3 men followed. Prater lingered for a moment, looked at Oren with the expression of a man who wants to ask a question, but has decided he's better off not knowing the answer, and then followed his employer into the snow. The room exhaled collectively, the way rooms do when pressure lifts. Abe Doss poured himself a drink. Corvin Holt, who had been watching from his corner, drained his glass and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man deciding something. Orrin came over to where Sella was sitting. Eli looked up at him with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise his curiosity. "You're very big," Eli observed. "I've been told," Orrin said. He looked at Sella. "Royce is going to push back. Prater will look for any flaw in the paperwork. We'll need to appear in front of the county judge in Cimarron within 14 days to affirm the claim in person." He paused. "It's a full day's ride. I can take you if the roan isn't up to the pace." Sella looked at him steadily. She was aware of the weight of what was being offered, not just the land, not just the legal help, but the fact of being escorted by the most quietly formidable man in the county at a moment when she needed exactly that kind of visible backing. She was also aware that accepting it required the kind of trust she had not extended to anyone, without reservation, in a very long time. She looked at Eli. He was drawing in the ash again, humming. "All right," she said. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow," Orrin said, "if he's strong enough." She looked at her son. He looked up at her and grinned, wide and gap-toothed, with no idea of the forces arranging themselves around his small life. "He'll be strong enough," she said. They left at first light, when the sky was the pale grey of unfinished things, and the snow lay in deep, clean ridges on either side of the trail. Orrin rode a big black gelding named nothing in particular, since Orrin did not name horses any more than he named mountains. They were what they were, and the name was beside the point. Sella's roan had been given a day's rest and oats, and had recovered enough of its dignity to move at a decent pace. Eli rode in front of his mother, wrapped in Orrin's elk-hide coat, which was enormous on him, and made him look less like a boy, and more like a small bear that had learned to sit upright. He asked questions for the first 4 miles. What was that bird? What made the snow turn blue in the shadows? Did the mountain man have a dog? Why not? And Orrin answered each one with the same unhurried patience, which surprised Sella almost more than anything else had. By mid-morning, they were climbing through a stretch of ponderosa pine, where the trail narrowed and the trees stood close on both sides, their bark the deep orange red of old copper in the low winter light. Snow came off the branches in soft explosions when the wind moved through. It was the kind of country that made people feel small in a way that was not threatening, but was simply honest, a reminder that the world was large and old and entirely indifferent to your problems, which in certain moods was exactly what a person needed to hear. Sella rode in silence for a while, letting the forest do its work. She thought about Benita, about the argument, the things said, the years of silence that had always felt like something she'd get around to repairing and now never would. The grief was not loud. It settled in her chest like river stone, cold, smooth, permanent. It would not leave. She had decided, somewhere in the last 2 days, that she would simply carry it. Around noon, they stopped beside a frozen creek to water the horses and eat. Orrin produced dried venison and hard bread, and a tin of something that turned out to be dried apricots, which Eli accepted as if they were gold coins. They ate without much talking. Eli found a patch of ice he could slide on, and occupied himself with that while the adults sat on fallen timber in the pale sun. "Tell me about my sister," Sela said finally. "The 2 years she was here without me." Orrin was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of reluctance, but of a man organizing what he knew. "She came through about 4 years ago," he said, "with her husband, Mateo. He was a good man. They worked the Rojas homestead, South Slope, good soil. She was... He stopped. She was direct, he said. She looked at the world straight on. He said it simply, without adornment, but Selah felt the weight of it anyway. He had known her sister, not as a name in a story, but as a person. Matteo died first, Oren said. A riding accident. 18 months ago. Benita kept the homestead running alone for 3 months, through winter, before the fever took her. He paused. She was not the kind of woman who asked for help. I brought supplies twice. She thanked me both times and tried to pay me, and both times I wouldn't take the money. He looked at the frozen creek. I wish I'd come a third time. The sentence landed quietly, without self-pity, just the plain acknowledgement of a missed thing. Selah felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She wasn't easy to help, Selah said. Neither of us was. Our father raised us to handle our own problems. That's a fine quality, Oren said. Until it isn't. Until it isn't, she agreed. Across the ice, Eli slid too far and sat down hard and looked at them with enormous dignity, and then burst out laughing. Both adults looked at him. The moment changed texture, softened slightly, the way cold air softens sometimes just before the sun finds a gap in the clouds. They rode into a brief trouble in the afternoon when 3 men appeared on the trail behind them. Not quite Royce's riders, but the type of men who worked for people like Royce, hired muscle with no particular commitment to any outcome except the one they were paid to produce. They didn't do anything except follow, keeping about a quarter-mile back, visible and intentional, which was its own kind of threat. Selah's hand moved to her coat, where the pistol sat. Oren noticed without looking at her. 6 bullets? He asked. 6, she said. I have 8, he said. He said it the way someone says they have enough sugar for the recipe. Practical, unperformative. He turned once in the saddle and looked at the 3 men behind them with the flat, assessing gaze of a man who has done the mathematics on situations like this many times before. The 3 men slowed. Then they stopped. They sat their horses on the trail for a long moment, then turned around and rode back the way they'd come. Selah watched them go. Friends of yours? She asked. Nobody's friends, Oren said. He faced forward and rode on. Cimarron in winter was a town that had folded itself inward, like a hand curled against cold. Cesar. Streets were quieter than their summer selves, the storefronts shuttered against the wind, the few figures moving along the boardwalks doing so quickly, and with the purposeful hunch of people who had somewhere specific to be. The courthouse was a square adobe building, with a painted sign above the door and a wood stove inside that made the front room feel like a held breath of warmth when they walked in. The county judge was a woman, a fact that seemed to have surprised exactly no one in the building except Harlan Royce, who had arrived an hour ahead of them and was already arranged across the bench from the judge's desk with Cole Prater beside him, and the smug, preemptive satisfaction of a man who considered the outcome settled. When Selah walked in, his expression tightened at the edges. When Oren Vass walked in behind her, the satisfaction left entirely. Judge Marisol Echeverria had served the county for 11 years and had the economy of movement and expression of someone who had heard most things at least twice and chose to be surprised by nothing. She was perhaps 60, with dark eyes and the patient attentiveness of a person who listens as a professional skill. She looked at the paperwork Oren set before her. Clean, complete, in the correct form, filed 2 days prior, and then looked at Cole Prater's competing claim, which had been filed the morning of their arrival, 9 hours after Selah's. She looked at both sets of documents for a long time without speaking. Prater cleared his throat and began to explain the history of the DeLacy parcel, and how his client had a standing interest in adjacent land development, and how the woman's claim had been filed without proper. He paused, searching for the word. Due process. The claim was filed by a citizen in the correct form with the correct fee, Judge Echeverria said, without looking up from the papers. Which part of that is due process? Prater had no answer. Royce tried next. He was smooth about it, not aggressive, but persuasive, the way large men with good voices are persuasive, filling the room with the reasonable sound of his confidence. He spoke about investment in the county, about development, about the community interest of a well-managed cattle operation versus a single homesteader on a marginal parcel. He was good at it. Salah listened and felt the familiar old pressure of a powerful man's certainty pressing against her, like a current against a swimmer. She said nothing. Oren stood at the back of the room with his hands folded and his face neutral, and let the silence be Royce's problem, which was a more sophisticated move than most of the men in the room recognized. When Royce finished, Judge Echeverria looked at Selah. "You'd like to speak to your claim?" "Yes," Selah said. She stepped forward. She had prepared nothing. She spoke clearly and without decoration. She was a widow in all practical senses. She had traveled 3 days through a mountain storm. She had a 6-year-old son, and she had filed a legal claim for land she intended to work and pay taxes on and inhabit in good faith until she died. "That's all," she said. The judge looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, in a way that might have been assessment or recognition or something harder to name. Then she looked at the papers again. Then she looked at Cole Prater. "The Crane claim was filed on the morning of March 5th, she said. "The Royce claim was filed this morning, March 7th. The law is not subtle on this point." She signed Salah's document with a firm motion. "The De Lacy parcel is registered to Salah Crane." She slid the papers across her desk. "I'd suggest getting your fences up before the spring thaw. The land tends to flood in the low section near the creek." Prater stood abruptly. Royce put a hand on his arm, not gently. The lawyer subsided. Royce looked at Selah with the controlled expression of a man recalculating his options and finding them acceptable, because men like Harlan Royce always had more options. But the calculation would take time, and time was something Selah now had more of than she'd had 3 days ago. She took the papers. Her hand didn't shake. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the flat, grey Cimarron afternoon, with the wind cutting through from the north, Selah stood holding a land deed with her name on it, and felt the solid, impossible fact of it settle into her bones. Eli stood beside her, examining a pebble he'd found with the intense, scholarly focus of a 6-year-old who has decided this pebble is significant. Oren stood a few steps away, looking at the street. "How did you get the claim filed so fast?" Selah asked. "I've been watching that parcel for 2 years," Oren said, "waiting for someone who needed it." She stared at him. "You were waiting for someone like me?" "Someone with reason to fight for it," he said. "Royce's men are lazy once a claim is contested. They'll push once, maybe twice, then move on to something easier." He looked at her sideways. "You don't seem like someone who gets easier." She laughed. It was short and surprised and entirely real, the first time she'd laughed in days, and the sound of it seemed to surprise even her. Eli looked up from his pebble. "Are we going home now?" he asked. Selah looked at the deed in her hand, then at the mountain man, then at her son. "Yeah," she said, "we're going home." They returned to find the De Lacy cabin burning. Not a catastrophic blaze, not enough to consume the stone foundation or the root cellar, but the timber walls were alight in a deliberate, patient way that was unmistakably the work of human hands rather than weather or accident. Someone had known they were coming back. The fire was visible for half a mile, an orange smear against the darkening mountain sky, and when they crested the last rise and saw it, Sela felt something go still in her with a terrible clarity. Eli was asleep against her chest, and she kept one arm around him and looked at the burning cabin with the expression of a woman who is deciding, in real time, exactly how much she can take and whether this is the line. Oren was already riding down the slope at a canter, his face set, and Sela pressed her heels in and followed. By the time they reached the clearing, the fire had spread to the outbuilding on the east side. 3 men were in the clearing. 2 of them Sela recognized as the riders who'd followed them on the Cimarron trail. The third was Corvin Holt, who had apparently found a use for his humiliation that went beyond sitting at a bar drinking through it. He was standing with a torch in his hand and a look on his face that was composed in equal parts of triumph and the particular recklessness of someone who has decided he has nothing left to lose. He hadn't expected Oren Vass to come down that slope at that pace, in the dark, without slowing. It was the mistake of a man who'd mistaken quietness for weakness. Oren pulled his gelding up 6 feet from Holt and looked at the burning cabin and then looked at the man, and even in the firelight the effect was significant. Holt's torch hand wavered. One of the 2 riders took a step backward. "This land is registered to Sela Crane," Oren said. His voice was not raised. "You are burning her property. That is a criminal act." "It ain't hers yet," Holt said, but his voice had already lost its certainty. "It's been hers since this morning," Oren said. "I have a copy of the judge's order in my coat. You want to read it?" Holt looked at the other 2 men. They looked back at him with the careful blankness of people who are reconsidering their employment decisions. Sela had her pistol out, steady, aimed at the ground between the 3 men, not pointed at anyone, but there and visible. In the firelight she looked nothing like the cold, bleeding woman who had walked into the Silver Spur 3 days ago. She looked like the ridge she'd climbed to get there, hard, unyielding, and prepared to be the last thing between her child and the cold. Corvin Holt looked at her, then at Oren. Then he dropped the torch in the snow, which extinguished it with a small, anticlimactic hiss that summed up everything about the situation. "This ain't over," he said, which is what men say when it is in fact over. But they need a way to walk out of the clearing with something left. "It's over," Oren said. "Ride south. Don't come back." There was a moment where Holt's pride struggled visibly with his survival instinct. Survival won, as it usually does in cold mountains in the dark, when a man is looking at someone like Oren Vass from 6 feet away. He turned and walked to his horse, and the 2 riders fell in behind him, and the 3 of them rode south through the trees without looking back. The cabin fire was still burning, but it was containable. The outbuilding was lost, but the main structure's stone walls had held, and the flames hadn't reached the roof yet. Oren dismounted and began throwing snow on the near wall with a methodical, practiced efficiency, and Sela secured Eli, who had woken and was watching with enormous, solemn eyes, in the saddle, and tied both horses to the tree line, and came back to help. They worked for an hour in the firelit dark, throwing snow, smothering, pulling burning boards away from the walls. The cold was vicious, but neither of them stopped. When the last flame guttered out, they stood in the smoke-stained dark and looked at what remained. What remained was enough. The walls stood. The roof was scorched but intact on the north and west sides. The floor was stone. The root cellar was untouched, and inside it, discovered when Oren pulled the hatch, were the previous owner's preserved stores, sealed jars, dried beans, a small barrel of salt pork, tools hung on the wall. Eli climbed down to investigate and came up with a jar of honey that he presented to his mother with the gravity of someone offering treasure, which it essentially was. Selah sat on the stone step of the ruined cabin door and looked at the mountain in the dark, at the stars coming out above the tree line, at the snow blue-white under the half-moon, at her son standing in the firelight, holding a jar of honey like a crown. And she felt something she hadn't felt in so long it took a moment to name it. Not happiness, exactly. Deeper than that. The bedrock feeling beneath happiness, the sense that you are in the right place, and that you have earned it, and that no one can take it from you tonight. She pressed her hand flat against the cold stone wall of the cabin. It was solid. It was hers. Spring came to the DeLacy parcel, Crane Parcel now, though it would be a year before the neighbors stopped calling it by the old name, in stages, the way spring always comes to high country, slow and uncertain at first. A few warm afternoons, undermined by hard frost. Then suddenly and all at once, the way a held breath finally releases. The creek thawed before anything else. Selah lay awake the first night she heard it running and listened to the sound of moving water for a long time in the dark. Because there are sounds that mean life in a way that goes past the ordinary, and running water in March in the mountains is one of them. Eli discovered the creek the next morning, before Selah was fully awake, and came back to the cabin, soaking to the knee and euphoric, and she dried him out by the rebuilt hearth and couldn't find it in herself to scold him, because the cold had crept back into his bones fast enough that she saw it happen, and felt the old clutch of fear, and then let it go, when he grinned at her with all his teeth. The cabin had taken the whole of late winter to repair. Orrin had helped. Not every day, not constantly, but on a schedule that felt like seasons rather than contracts. He would come down the mountain on certain mornings with timber already cut and notched and carry it up the slope to the parcel, and they would work until dark. And on those evenings, he would eat dinner at the small table Selah had salvaged from the burned-out building. And Eli would sit across from him and ask questions, and Orrin would answer them, and the silence between questions was not uncomfortable. Selah had thought, in those early weeks, that she was still calculating him, trying to determine the angle, the cost, the debt she was accumulating. She realized sometime in February that she had stopped calculating. She did not know exactly when it had happened, but she noticed its absence, the way you notice the absence of a sound that has been so constant you'd stopped hearing it. Harlan Royce sent a lawyer's letter in early March, 3 weeks after the incident at the cabin. The letter argued several things, none of them legally sound, and Orrin read it at Selah's table, with the patient expression of a man being told a story he already knows the ending to. He wrote a response that was 2 sentences long and cited 4 separate statutes by name and number, and he mailed it from the Arroyos Blancos post office on his next supply run. The lawyer's response came 5 days later and was significantly shorter than the first letter. There were no more letters after that. Whether Royce had moved his attention elsewhere or had made some quieter calculation about the cost of persistence, Selah never found out. She didn't need to. The land was hers. The deed was filed. The judge's signature was real. Some fights are won, not in a single dramatic blow, but in the slow, patient accumulation of legal reality, and this had been one of them. Corvin Holt left Arroyos Blancos before the snow fully melted. Nobody knew where he went, and nobody asked, which was its own kind of judgment. The Silver Spur got new curtains in the spring, a small, peculiar detail that Selah noted when she rode through Arroyos Blancos in April on her way to the Mercantile. Eli on the roan, in front of her, and pulled up outside long enough to look at the building that had been the site of the worst and then the best moment of a single night. Abe Doss was on the porch, sweeping. He saw her and nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. She rode on. Eli wanted to know what she was looking at. A place where something happened, she told him. He considered this with 6-year-old seriousness. Good something or bad something? Both, she said. He nodded, as if this were an entirely satisfying answer, which perhaps it was. Orrin Vass came down from the mountain on the first real warm day of spring, a Tuesday in late April, when the sky was the deep, uncomplicated blue of something that has finally made up its mind. He brought 2 young goats for the property, which Eli immediately named with the absolute authority of a child who understands that naming things is the first act of ownership. He also brought seeds wrapped in cloth, squash, beans, a cutting of wild plum that he said would grow if she planted it on the south side with its roots near the creek. He explained this to Sella, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden. She'd already begun to turn. And when he finished, she looked at him, standing in the April light with the goats and the seeds and the long, easy silence that had become its own kind of language between them, and she thought about the night in the Silver Spur, about the chair he had simply picked up and moved, without theatre, without explanation, because it was the right thing, and he was the kind of man who did right things the way a river finds the low path. Not dramatically, but inevitably. She thought about her sister, who had known something about people that Selah was still learning. She thought about Eli naming the goats with absolute confidence in his own authority. Then she said, "Stay for dinner." Orrin looked at her. Something in his January lake eyes shifted like ice at the edge of the melt, still cold, but beginning, at the very edges, to move. "All right," he said, and he stayed.